Giving growth feedback is difficult for most leaders. Actually, I've yet to meet a leader who enjoys giving growth feedback, but it doesn't have to be as hard as we make it. Here are some tips to make giving growth feedback easier. My first tip is to stop avoiding it. This is probably the most impactful change you can make as a leader. You're doing both yourself and the employee a disservice by avoiding the tough conversations. Thinking about it is taking up precious mental capacity in your brain, and the employee isn't getting the opportunity to be aware of your concerns and therefore make the necessary adjustments. There are many reasons leaders avoid giving growth feedback. Sometimes it's because you're not sure what to say or how to say it. Sometimes it's because you're worried about hurting the person's feelings. Sometimes it's because you anticipate they're going to get defensive and disagree with you, and you just don't want to deal with it. But all of these reasons, whether conscious or unconscious, for avoiding a difficult conversation, all come down to one thing. What you're really trying to avoid is your own discomfort. But discomfort is a price for growth, both for you and for the people you lead. When we avoid giving feedback, all we're doing is letting our frustration build and build until one day we're going to let it out at the worst possible moment. And those moments of frustration are what really destroy trust. Tip number two is to implement the 24-hour rule for giving growth feedback. To develop the skill of providing timely and specific feedback, commit to this 24-hour rule. All that means is that you're holding yourself accountable to giving growth feedback within 24 hours of recognizing that you need to do it. The 24-hour rule does two things. One, it prevents you from letting things build up, and it helps you address frustrations more quickly. That usually leads to a much better conversation and outcome because it's fresh in your mind and it'll be fresh in the other person's mind as well. It also builds trust because of consistency. When you commit to giving feedback within 24 hours, the reputation you'll earn is that people will know where they stand with you. They won't question whether you're hiding something, and they probably won't think that you're thinking things about them, but not saying them. If we want to build trust in our relationship, consistency is a powerful way to do that. But before you give feedback, always ask yourself, where's the feedback coming from? If it's coming from a place of anger or frustration, now is probably not the right time to give that feedback. You might want to waive the 24-hour rule for yourself. The goal is always to give feedback from a place of caring and wanting to help the other person grow and wanting to build trust and connection. If you struggle at all with giving growth feedback, I really encourage you to take on this 24-hour challenge. It will be a great way to evolve as a leader. In addition to those two tips, I want to talk about the flow of a growth feedback conversation. It's really important, but it's not very often discussed. First, feedback is exactly that. It's a conversation. It's not a one-way dialogue. At its best, feedback is a chance to get curious about both yourself and the other person and to build stronger connections and greater trust. I'm going to share some suggestions for the flow of a feedback conversation and even examples of how to phrase things so that you can really set yourself up for a compassionate and effective dialogue. This is not, however, a prescription for the conversation. So take what resonates and what makes sense for you and make it your own. It's really most important that feedback comes from an authentic place. It's truly the only way to build trust. So before the meeting, clearly state the purpose of the meeting so that the person knows what to expect and isn't blindsided by your feedback. You might say something like, I'd like to give you feedback about the presentation and talk about some things that went well, and also some things that I think we might be able to do better next time. I'd like to get your perspective too. So I want to take today to think about it and organize my thoughts. Can we meet tomorrow at 2 p.m., for example? If you want, you can also share the feedback in advance of the meeting, so long as there's still a conversation about the feedback, a live conversation. That's the only way to have a true dialogue. This might be better for people who do best with processing feedback before having a conversation about it. You'll know your people well enough to know who this is going to work best for. You might say something like, I have some feedback about the presentation and I'd love to have a conversation about it with you tomorrow. I thought it might be helpful to give you some of my thoughts in advance. Here are some things that I thought went really well, and here are some things that I thought we could have done better. Obviously, list the things that went well and the things that you think could go better. Then say, I'd love to get your perspective on that tomorrow and also hear more about what you think went well and what could have been improved. I'm looking forward to talking about it tomorrow. So for the opening of the conversation, because you've already stated the purpose of the meeting, that makes your opener a lot easier. You could say something like, I'm glad we have time to talk about this. Thanks for making it a priority. As you know, I have some feedback I'd like to share about the presentation yesterday. I'd love to give you that feedback, see what you think about it, and then also talk about any additional feedback you have for me. Let's say you haven't been able to state the purpose of the meeting in advance. Sometimes that might happen. You might say something like, I have some feedback about the presentation that I'd like to talk through. Is now a good time for that? If the person says no, schedule a time to meet and talk about it. Try to still do that within 24, 48 hours. Then you could even say something like, would it be helpful if I gave my feedback in advance of our meeting so that you have time to look at it and process? If so, I can send it to you before we meet. Please feel free to do the same for me, and I can think through that before we meet to discuss. When it comes time to delivering the feedback during the conversation, try out the keep and consider approach to feedback. You could set it up like this. Here are some things that I think went really well that I think we should keep doing. List those out. And here are some things that I thought could be better that you might consider taking a different approach on next time, and then share your thoughts on that. Really simple. Always seek to understand. This is the part where you shift your feedback to a dialogue. You could say something like, tell me what you think. I'd love to learn your perspective. And then try to say, tell me more a few times after to take the conversation just a little bit deeper and see if you can really seek to understand where the other person is coming from. Before responding to the other person's thoughts with your perspective, first repeat what you heard. This is the key to making someone feel heard and understood in the conversation. It could go something like this. Thanks so much for sharing your thoughts with me. It sounds like you think ABC and XYZ. Did I get that right? If you got it right, fantastic. You can move on. If not, now the person has the chance to try again. You could say something like, I'm so glad I asked. I want to make sure I really understand where you're coming from. Could you explain it again? After you respond to the person's perspective on your feedback, it's time to ask them what feedback they have for you specifically. You could say something like, I'd love to know more about how you see my role in this. What feedback do you have for me? Now it's time to make commitments. This is the part where you get to work together. You could say something like, let's identify some commitments that will help us get a better outcome in the future. On my end, it would mean a lot to me if you could commit to ABC. What do you think about that? And what would you like me to commit to on my end? Now, sometimes it might make sense to think on this part a little bit and have some time to process before determining next steps and commitments. So you could say something like, what if we both took some time to think about the feedback we've given each other, and when we meet again, we can come back prepared to share our ideas for commitments so that we can get a better outcome next time? And be sure to schedule follow up. If it's necessary, which it most likely will be, set up a time to regroup so that you can continue the conversation. Try to follow up within a week to keep the momentum going. Agree on a time to follow up in your meeting so it remains a priority and it's on calendars right away. Now, this might seem obvious, but say thank you. Be sure to end the conversation by saying thank you, even if you disagree with the person and their perspective. It builds trust for future conversations. You could say something like, thank you so much for your willingness to hear my feedback today, and thank you for being so open and willing to share your feedback with me. If you do disagree, you could add something like, I know our perspectives on this are different, but regardless, I'm still glad that we talked about it because you've given me a lot to think about. I just want to make one last note about growth feedback conversations. Let's say the other person is getting defensive or shutting down somewhere in the conversation, or maybe you start to get defensive and you can feel yourself shutting down. You could say something like, listen, this conversation is really important to me, and so are you. So I want to be sure that we're both showing up at our best for it. Why don't we take the rest of the day to process and think about it, and we'll reconvene tomorrow? It's totally okay to take a pause. And there you have it. So now get out there and have that growth feedback conversation that you've been avoiding. Listen, we all do it. No shame. But now you have the tools to go after it. And don't forget to download the free high impact one-to-one meeting toolkit at the link in the description below, because having a consistent and effective one-to-one meeting practice greatly reduces the need to have growth feedback conversations to begin with. Thanks for watching.